Yeah, and he thought he had a life going to those classes, no more. Right, okay, we're going to get started. We're now on YouTube. We're going to do a subject that's quite familiar.
But I just
go on. Oh, we haven't done any news. We need to do news.
Yeah,
news.
No, we were sat watching CNN on the hotel telly last night, and there was an article about a very old mosaic, older than even well before Roman times, found in Jordan, I believe. They'd uncovered it recently. It was fantastic. Yeah, it wasn't a mosaic like the Romans had, with its picture of the gods and all that. It was more of a pattern, more of a that sort of thing. But it was very, very old, apparently. Sorry, I didn't get enough details for you for that. But,
oh, right, that's a bit of a shame. Do you want me to look that up now, or?
Oh no, I just thought you could put it in your back pocket, and if you get time, check it out.
Okay, because you said we haven't got much time today. So it was a Jordan mosaic.
I believe it was Jordan mosaic, just found by the local authorities.
Oh, fabulous. Fabulous. So one thing I want to do today is I want us to look at doggerland, and many of the things I've said about doggerland will be familiar. So as we haven't got a lot of time, I'm just gonna push through it and try and make the points that I made. It's unlikely I'm going to be able to make all the points, because when you're trying to get through things at a little bit more of a pace, you miss things, but we'll give it a go. And thank God Roger was a little bit more calm yesterday. No, he ripped into me the previous week. We had this earlier lecture, and it was just like, right, guys, we've got to make sure that we're finished at a certain time. And it slightly went over. I said, look, we've got to do the questions. And Roger was fine. It was almost as if it was a bit of bravado. I don't know why.
It's human nature.
Yeah.
Makes all sorts.
The thing is, the main thing is I don't bite. Right. So doggerland. So I'm going to get straight onto an image straight off. And I would ask, is there, when we think about doggerland, what is your interpretation of it? Where is it?
Well, Doggerland, North Sea. Presently, the Dogger Bank is referred to. It's between the Netherlands and the east coast of the UK. It was a bit of land that was occupied and now flooded. Yeah.
No, that's a nice way of putting it all. Right. So
I think I told you a lot of my seafaring friends in the dredging industry were told me tales of picking up all sorts of articles while they were dredging in the North Sea and the surrounding area of people living there and animal bones and all sorts of stuff.
Can I just ask you? Can I just ask you a really off-key question?
Yeah.
Right. Say that you're the average sailor, right? Yeah. And somebody said to you that there's never been land between Great Britain and Denmark, right? That's the first thing. And then the next thing is you go out to sea, and you dredge something up. Obviously dredging, that's going to be where you take the crap off the sea bottom, or you trawl something in, which could be anything, right? Whatever way you want to look at it, right? So in your head, you're convinced that there was never any land between Britain and Denmark.
No, I don't think that would be the case at all for a seafarer.
No. But what I'm trying to say, you're a seafarer that believes there was never any land there, right? I'm just trying to pitch this one, right? You're a seafarer that never ever believed there was any land there, right? So you dredge a big piece of peat in, right? And you break open a peat. There's a mammoth tusk, and there's a piece of work flint directly buried in the peat. How would you interpret that if you solely believe that there was never any land between Great Britain and Denmark? How did it get there? What would your explanation be?
Well, you couldn't really give a valid explanation, could you?
Oh,
They
but
could say
I'm forcing you to make
it's
one. I'm forcing.
fallen on a ship or something. It's fallen
Right.
in there.
Ah, right. Oh, yeah. No, that okay. That's fine. That's probably where I wanted. That's probably where I wanted to lead you.
But I think
It-
most people, like my colleagues that told me this, if it was something interesting, they'd take it home and put it in the front room, you know, and pass it on to their grandchildren. An artifact that they found. Now, I don't think many would say, "Well, I better take this to the museum." You know.
so that then it comes down the other way round. Obviously, not much time. Then it comes around the other way round. How do you validate that there was land there? When not all the archaeologists, most of the archaeologists are saying there was never any land there. We're the professionals. You're just a guy who puts on a hat, goes out to sea, risks your lives, and bringing the fish to put on our table. What right does it give you to tell me there was any land there?
Well, I don't think they're in a working environment, Carl. They wouldn't even think about that. That wouldn't be on their mind.
So in other words,
argument, they accept what they would do because they're working in a separate sort of thing. They wouldn't come across an archaeologist.
ah, right, okay, that's another thing. So again, there's worlds within worlds. Okay, what you're saying, what you're saying, what you are saying, and you're rightly saying that there are different types of people. For example, I come across certain types of people that you wouldn't come across. You come across certain types of people that I wouldn't come across.
Yeah.
I don't really know much about the rugby world, but I've got a very good friend called Joshua Navidi that's a frontline player for the Welsh team. But whenever I speak to him, right, he's not interested in speaking to me about rugby. He don't want to speak to me about rugby. He wants to speak to me about archaeology, you know. So even when you get people who are in certain professions, they have a tendency not to want to talk about what they do. Actually, to be honest with you, I get a lot of people when you say, "Oh, I'm an archaeologist," which is they say, "Oh, wow," but I don't want to talk about it because I've just been teaching about it. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, Doggerland was an area of land now submerged beneath the North Sea. End of. Now, one thing was pointed out to me yesterday was that where the hell is Scandinavia? So on this map, and I've looked at this for years, and I know the book that this is in, and yeah, Scandinavia should be there where Doggerland is marked on there. But when we look at the idea of Doggerland, there's so many different interpretations of what Doggerland looked like, and when I look at a map like this, I don't like it because I always say that the tree land moved over to Great Britain, and the only way that the tree line would have been able to move over to Britain was that if the word channel there, that must have been dry land for that to happen. So there are different ways of looking at maps and plans, but no matter how people draw these things, there's always a land bridge between Europe and Great Britain. That's a given. What isn't a given is it's half and a half. People like me and lots of people like me believe that Ireland was connected to mainland Britain 12,000 years ago. Some people don't believe it was. But what we discussed about Ireland last week must have brought about the idea that Ireland, to have had its innovations and skills and development, must have been connected to mainland Britain at some stage. However, I present another argument today, which is not really about Ireland, which is quite catastrophic, and it developed on Tuesday and it developed on Thursday. And even if I get a little bit of the catastrophe across, you will understand that it answers why there are lots of trees missing, why technology really accelerated. Those two questions are answered in this lecture because of, you're lucky today because you've got the wisdom of two other classes and a lot of thinking. So geological surveys have suggested that what we do find, this world stretched far more greater than what we're looking at now. So the reason why we're using this, it nicely cites Dogger Hills and sort of Dogger Bank, sort of in that area, maybe a little bit towards the south, beyond that little bit of water there. But that's the sort of Doggerland area. Now, again, quoting from my notes, it was probably, I would say, the word probably a rich habitat with human habitation in the Mesolithic period is an understatement. This itself was far greater a Garden of Eden than humanity has ever seen. And that's not an exaggeration. By finding the artifacts that you discuss and I discuss, which have been dredged and trawled up from the seas around our coast, we're not talking about North Sea, we're talking about the English Channel, we're talking about northwestern the North Sea, we're talking about the Irish Channel, the Irish Sea as well. These artifacts have been found all over the place, large quantities of artifacts, not just dating from 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, dating to 40,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago. People have been living in and out of this landscape for a very, very long time. Now, the two things that we do discuss, which I really want to focus on today, if we don't do anything else, is this idea. And now what we need to do, we need to go away from this. And we'll just kick on over there. There's a lot more green stuff further north than the earlier plan. So if we look at that one there, we think Doggerland, Dogger Bank, Dogger Hills, whatever you want to call it, Doggerland. There you go. Some people discuss that all this yellow area at some stage was actually land as well. Well, we're going to leave that for a moment. In fact, we're going to leave that completely because it takes away the facts of what I want to look at. Dating wise, 8,500 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 8,250 years ago on the August the 27th. I'm not exactly interested in the exact dates. What I'm interested in is at one point that was dry land and it's no longer dry land. How did the occurrence, and we're still in the introductory, how did the occurrence occur that Doggerland was flooded? It's not an easy answer, but the after effect is an easy answer to lots of questions that we've been asking. And I think we've been doing the Mesolithic period since April. This lecture itself is in two parts. It's this week and it's in a few weeks' time when I decide I want to do it. And then we go into the Neolithic period. What we are seeing is at least around 8,000 years ago, for Britain, this was the end of our Mesolithic. We are clearly into a period of technical innovation and advances that surpass anything. And one point I made yesterday at the very end, which I will forget now, is that whenever we think about the flooding of Doggerland, it not only affected Greater Britain, it affected the Scandinavias, like including Denmark, it included lowland countries, and the excessive flooding that affected the lowland countries lasted for generations, right? And it catastrophically affected us for generation upon generation, therefore needing a technical innovation. And I've almost given away what I wanted to discuss later on, but I've not given much detail. The other point as well is that we're talking around just beyond that yellow area there at the top of the screen, there was something known as the Trogger Bank, or the Storiga Bank, the Strogger Bank or Storiga Bank. The Storiga Bank, there was some kind of a landslide approximately 8,500 years ago to coincide with the flooding of Doggerland. What's all that about? Landslide causing a tsunami? No, a landslide causes a tidal wave. A tsunami is the events that we look at of the 26th of December 2004. So where water goes out and then water comes back in. The tidal wave that came from the Storiga landslide underwater, was a tidal wave that humanity has never ever seen. And when we think about it, this was far more catastrophic than the end of the Minoan civilization, 1,068 years BC, with the eruption of Thera, and the light sky was blackened out for 5 years. This event was more catastrophic than Noah's flood. This event was more catastrophic than the flood of Gilgamesh. This event itself, as one person last night so said, this is actually the real Noah's flood, except nobody survived. And actually, the story about Dogger Bank and what happened to Dogger Bank after this flood is also answered. So 3 issues: trees, massive technical innovation, and what happened to Dogger Bank and the people at Dogger Bank after the Great Flood. Those 3 massive questions are answered in this lecture. So I can't be any more fairer than that. Why is it called Doggerland? It's obviously named after little Dutch boats known as doggers, which I do believe were around at the time of the English and Spanish armadas as well. Little dogger boats, doggers. It's named after those little Dutch fishing boats that were sent out in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and hence why it's known as the Dogger Bank. Now, hypothetically, there's nothing hypothetical about the what happened. Right. Let's just be realistic, right? There's nothing hypothetical about the Great Flood. It happened. You've got land there, and there's no longer land. That's not science. That's not hypothetical. It happened. Let's not use the word hypothetical. It's an event that we know happened. We think about Noah's flood. We don't know when Mount Ararat or whatever. They think they found the remains of a great ship up there, right? Equally, I could argue that if somebody knew that was a great flood coming, and they believed that everything was going to be wiped out and destroyed, and so on and so on, if you go to the highest upland area possible, that could spiritually be your Noah's Ark. The place that you are standing is your ark, your vessel of protection on top of a hill. That may be the interpretation of Noah's Ark. The easiest think about it logically, right? You build a compound, right? You get as many animals up there as possible, keep them in the compound, see the Great Flood come in, destroying everything, and then you release the animals. Job done, Noah's Ark. Easy. In fact, today they use the word ark to define a place of learning, an ark to define a place to go, right? That's what an ark is. It's not necessarily a boat. Anyway, let's just leave that one there. So the archaeological potential of this area was first identified in Clement Reid's book, Submerged Forests, which was published in 1913. But Submerged Forests and Arthur Keith's book in 1915 were books of imagination. So were the words of H.G. Wells in 1897. So were the words so were all those words of all these other writers, like Jules Verne. These things were seen to be words of fantasy. H.G. Wells even described in 1897 this land. But H.G. Wells is a writer. He's a fiction writer. But he was a fiction writer writing on fact. But it was dismissed. And everything that was being trawled up, anything being dredged up and dumped on the coast of the Netherlands, for example, we dismissed it, but the people in Europe didn't. Now, the reason why Clement Reid's work and Arthur Keith's work and H.G. Wells's work was dismissed is because 1913, 1914, the year later after the book had been published, was the year of that absolutely pointless, terrible war that consumed many millions of lives across Europe. And I will argue with anyone who tries to justify the First World War and even the Second World War, but that's something else. People in Britain did not want to think there was ever a physical connection with Great Britain and Europe. By saying that we were once linked to Europe, no longer gives us a mandate to discuss those little ants, to destroy those little ants, those Germans that were sprawling over the borders in Belgium and France. It would have given us no justification to go to war against them because they're our brothers, right? But because there's no land bridge between Great Britain and Europe, perceived no land bridge, even though your fishermen are saying they are, and even though there's some writers saying there are, we can't have a physical link with Europe. It gives us a justification to kill as many Germans as we possibly can because they're not our brothers, they're the Hun, they're aliens, they're evil people, because there's no land bridge. This is what the politicians were saying in the day. So the work of Clement Reid was simply seen to be a work of an abhorrent lunatic that has no idea what he's talking about. Except Clement Reid's book was based on archaeological fact. Forests all the way around our coast, exactly the same forest which were on the opposite side of the channel, right? Dating evidence from under the sea, all of this stuff, it was fictitious nonsense. Those trees were dumped there. Those trees in the River Thames, they're just not trees, right? They would do anything to discredit Clement Reid. Even in 1931, which we'll go on to in a short while, there was a fishing trawler out off the Wash 25 miles out, dragged up, trawled up, dragged up in the nets, a big chunk of peat. And in that big chunk of peat contained a barbed antler point under a meter, under a foot in length, a barbed antler point, which is a bit of reindeer with barbs on it cut into it. And the person who trawled that in basically took it to Hull Museum in 1931, and there it remained until 1941. And the Luftwaffe made a direct hit on the museum when it flew out from Norway. We did not believe that German bombers could actually reach that far from Norway, but they did, and they destroyed Hull Museum. But vessels still dragged up the remains of mammoth, the remains of various animals, human remains, prehistoric tools and weapons, chunks of peat with artifacts, even the remains of lion bones, right? But they were just chucked in the museum in Hull, or, as you're right in saying, Goff, that they were kept in people's attics, basements, given to their children, or chucked out by the missus when the husband had died. And the one point is that you've bumped into Mike, haven't you, Goff, online? And Mike had 4 little fishing smacks. So he would go out in the off the Solent, and they would go out, and he would trawl up various artifacts, which he would just keep on board the ship. And when he sold the boat, he just left it all on there. And this, you're right. If archaeologists are not interested, and nobody's really interested, why show anyone? So all this stuff was coming up. It's not their fault. If people are deriding them for finding these things, why should they even bother showing it to an archaeologist? As you're right in saying, they didn't mix with archaeologists anyway. It was only until the late 1980s, early 1990s that the idea of Doggerland really started to take shape. And the work of Clement Reid turned into be the Bible of archaeologists interested in Doggerland. So in other words, what you're talking about 1 minute the Bible, the actual Bible now, right? 1 minute the actual Bible itself in the Holy Land is fictitious nonsense. So the next minute it's archaeological fact. With Clement Reid's book in 1913, not that it was seen as archaeological fact, it was archaeological fact, because he was describing stuff using photographs of some of the things that were still there, so they could be proven to be real. So this is more biblical than the Bible itself. As of 2020, international teams have continued using various 3D imagery of the floor of this landscape, using archaeogeophysical techniques, which is basically having a boat, having the usual same techniques used overland, where they would take a pulse down to the sea bottom, and it would work out when it comes back, get an idea of the seafloor. Computer simulation, molecular biology, studying absolutely everything, looking at the environment, ecological change, human transition, hunter-gatherer, farming communities, and all these other things. All this study was actually going places. It was actually going places. Now, if we sort of go there, do you know what, right? I wish the people who actually created these things knew what they were doing, because that word tsunami should read 6,500 years BC or 8,500 years ago. And when you actually start analyzing it, right? That date is very important, except they got it wrong. All this green stuff here is where all this land was, and obviously this is the area of the Dogger Bank. Now the Dogger Bank comes into its own. Forget that date there. We're looking at 8,500 years ago. So one of the things that we do know is that this had been land and water replicated throughout the generations, throughout at least a half a million years. Water had ebbed and flowed over this landscape, except it's still there. And what we do find within this landscape over that 500,000 years, there'd been water, there'd been Great Lakes, there'd been all sorts of things. But what we do know, there'd been various movements of animals up and down this world. And at one point, this was a savanna-like landscape. At least maybe about 1,500 years ago, this was a savanna-like landscape where lions, cheetahs, normal long tusk elephants, and all these other things roamed. Now, what we do feel and what we do think is that we're getting a good idea of those early rivers. And what you can actually see is the Rhine heading out there. You can actually see the Thames heading out there, and these actually traced underwater to have been much longer rivers at one time when the sea wasn't there. They were part of the sort of landscape. Now, one thing I am going to say is that I'm going to describe this as I did last night. When we think about this world, what we've got to think on is that the water level, okay, the water level from 12,000 years ago, running all the way up until even 6,000 years ago, a little after the events of 8,500 years ago, the water level was rising. And it's believed that the water level rose 100 meters over that period of time. Whether you want to say that the water level rose between 12,000 and 8,000 or 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, 100 meters. But some people believe that the water level rose a lot more than that, 120 meters. The 12,000 years ago, the land was 120 meters lower, 120 meters lower from where it is today, which is quite phenomenal. And even thinking of 100-meter rise in water, if you go down to your local cliff at Lantwick Major, most of the cliff there is about 20 meters in height. A rise in sea level 100 meters in height. So if you times the height of that cliff down a Cahul Bay of about 20 meters, if you times that by 5, that's the rise in water level over a period of over 4,000 years, which is absolutely quite phenomenal. We can't even we can't even put it in our minds. We can't even guesstimate what that means. Now, just a little interesting thing is that humanity is a little bit stupid in that it puts its major rivers directly on river tributaries, like the River Thames. So if the water level rose consistently in the River Thames Delta by, I would say, a quarter of a meter, London would be underwater. And that wouldn't take a lot. If the water level rose, the River Thames consistently 1 meter, everything would have to be evacuated. We would have no sewage system. Everything would be gone. That would be serviceable. And why we build cities still in these areas and we keep these cities, I don't know. People talk about having Manchester as the capital city of Britain. That's not a bad idea. The Brazilians actually did it. They when they decided that they were going to build a new city, no, Brasilia, they, instead of making Rio de Janeiro bigger or Sao Paulo bigger, what they did, they went into the sort of semi-heart of the Amazon rainforest and they built the new city far away from the sea. We as human beings haven't learned the lessons of the past. We just don't learn. You know, for today, I know it's just a border skirmish, but we're Russia's at war with Ukraine. You know, we've gone. There are wars even today, and we think, why don't humans learn from these? Learn from having terrible wars, right? We don't learn the stories about water either. We don't believe that the events that occurred to Doggerland 8,000 years ago could ever happen again. Yes, they can. They were repeated on the South Wales coast on the 20th of January, 1606. In fact, We have had stormy conditions in the 1950s along the East Anglia coastline that flooded miles and miles of land. You know, these events can happen again, and we as human beings don't learn from them. What we're finding across this landscape is that the contours of the present seabed are to be seen. And obviously, at one point, the River Seine joined with the Thames. And all of these sort of flowed into, as you can actually see on the plan. Now, what I did last night was to try and get into the dramatic nature of, and maybe I should do it now. And what I should do is, as I did last night, I wasn't totally prepared. I basically, hang on. When I say I wasn't totally prepared, I needed to grab another image. What I did to explain the next bit. And this is where it gets very dramatic. We could get an image, the right image, I hope. Right, okay. I've not seen that image there. I'm just gonna sort of that image, which there was just an image that came up then, which that doesn't show the flooding of Doggerland in the way that I need to tell it, because it was far more dramatic than that. It was far more dramatic than a great tidal wave, but it involved that level of humanity. What we need to do is imagine this, the Great Garden of Eden. Now, I love that image. It's a really nice image. So if we go back, and we'll come back to that one now. This is the one I usually show. This is a wonderful piece of art. Now, this is a wonderful piece of art. Now, we'll explain the other way around. Now, when I discuss the Doggerland, what I say is, up until the great event that they call the Great Tsunami, the Stratega land slip, they call it a tsunami. I call it a great tidal wave. There's two differences, but okay, some archaeologists are not as savvy as doing this for years like me. We'll call it a great wave, a great tidal wave. Now, up until that point, up until that very moment, just before we get there, if somebody lived 40, 50, 60 years, they would see a dramatic change within their landscape. Okay, that guy standing there, he's standing there and saying, look, that building over there, 2 years ago, that was dry land. Now it's no longer dry land. Or there's been a little seasonal flood, and that bit of the village has been engulfed with water forever. If we take the other point, if you live 40 to 50, that's over sort of a year, 2 years or whatever, or maybe over 5 years. If you take the following point, if you live 40, 50, 60 years, within that 60 years, within several generations, the land that you used to farm, the land that used to live, the land that used to fish, the land that was a complete Garden of Eden, the land that the dog used to run around, and all the rest of it, right? That is now several meters underwater. That is a very difficult concept for me to grasp. And it's a realistic concept to grasp. But, Goff and myself, I've lived over 40 years. I've not seen the coastline evaporate like this. I go down to Barry Island and there's still the same sand. I go down to the old harbour and there's still the same mud. There's more mud. I go to the Lantic Major coastline. Yeah, lots of the cliff has gone, but it's still the same beach. Nothing much has happened at all. We go back to the. I'm building up to something. If we go back to this other image, this is a Garden of Eden. In fact, I would like to put a couple of buildings there. I would like to put a few more trees, a few more animals, and what I would really like to do there is make it even more Garden of Eden. Put berries, loads of different trees. Have it looking, having a timber boat there. You know, all that stuff that we'd be looking about the Mesolithic period. Boulder Cliff between the at the Solent, just it's 18 meters down, but it's 100 meters off the coast of Boulder Cliff on the Isle of Wight. We're talking about platforms for fishing. We're talking about buildings. We're talking about everything. It's a true wonder what we've been finding. So everything that we see there is here. We look at Hoik, we look at the footprints at Form B and all these other things that we've been saying. So it's brilliant. You're sat there, you're looking out at the lagoons, the salt marshes, you know, in the mud flats, there's all the mollusks that you could ever want to eat. Beaches, you've got wood being washed up, you've got various shellfish, you can go fishing, you've got inland streams, you've got plenty of freshwater mussels, you've got eels, you've got everything you can possibly eat. There's birds, you can collect anything you need. There's otters, there's wolves, there's bears, there's everything. There's reindeer. It's fairly warm. The temperature is higher than it is today. This is there's apples growing on the trees. It's absolutely beautiful. You feel perfectly safe. You know, over time, what you're looking at, a little bit of water will come in and fine, right? There are lakes, marshes. This is described as the richest hunting, fowling, and fishing grounds in Europe, and I will use the word ever. This is the finest landscape that we have ever had. And here's where the dramatic thing comes. And if we go, the dramatic thing comes with, if we think of that. Basically, one event wipes away all of that says extent of dry land. The water rushes into the coastline that we've got today, up to 20 miles. A tidal wave that we've got no idea of the height. If the tidal wave was a meter high, it would wipe everybody out. If the tidal wave was 5 meters high, it would wipe everything off the face of that landscape. Whatever height the tidal wave was, it was so dramatic. Nothing survived. No animals, no human beings, not a tree. Everything 20 miles inland off that present coastline in Great Britain and in the lowlands was completely decimated. You could not outrun this tidal wave. It probably went faster than a tsunami wave at 37 miles per hour and more. Nothing survived. Everything that I've said, everything that I've ever postulated is wrong. I used to say to people, you could have survived. You could have been one of the survivors of this great tidal wave. The answer is no, you couldn't. There is no way you could have survived it. If you were 20 miles, where the coastal margin is there in Great Britain, right? That didn't exist. But if you can think about it, we've got recorded sediment 20 miles from the existing coast all the way inland. That land would have been covered in trees. Not a single one of those trees would have survived because of the saline conditions of the water. There would be no survivors. And the other thing I've got wrong for many, many years is the Dogger Bank. I've always said that the survivors of the Dogger Bank were very sad survivors because eventually they would be trapped and isolated on an island. What I've got wrong, Goff, is that nobody would have survived on that island. It would have been game over. The water, what we do know, and we know through all the evidences that we've ever seen with tidal waves and tsunami waves, is that they keep going. Palacastra in 1628 years BC, the evidence tells us that the tidal wave at Palacastro from the events of Thera erupting was that the tidal wave kept going at 37 miles per hour. It did not stop. It went inland mile after mile after mile. We do know that the events of the 20th of January in the year 1606, that supposed great tsunami, great tidal wave, more like, people are obsessed with the word tsunami. The tidal wave is enough, it kills you. We know that the water headed inland without being checked or stopped all the way to the foothills of Caerphilly. It kept going. It kept going and going without anything stopping it, over mountains, through valleys, through dales, over everything. It kept going. Nothing survived. And this is how dramatic this is. I've mentioned one of the answers for Doggerland. I haven't really mentioned about the technology. I'm really mentioning about the trees, but we'll crack on. So what we do have is 3D seismic surveys being undertaken within this landscape. And then one other thing I need to do, there's a few other things I need to do, but what I need to do is I need to get back to this. And I want to go back a little bit more. Hang on a minute. We go there. And actually, I got myself distracted a moment. This, I got quite excited about this on Tuesday. I've distracted myself deliberately. The one biggest problem that we got excavating Doggerland is the fact that most of the archaeology is 50, 60, 70, 80 meters below sea level, right? Lots of it is 20 meters below sea level, which with the tidal currents of particular the Dover Straits, and most of the sea coast at Jutland and all the rest of it, you've got heavy currents. So we don't need to remind ourselves of Biscay. So we've got really heavy currents. And excavating underwater is very fraught. So most of the Danish archaeologists like to excavate just off the coastline, 5, 6, maybe 8 meters in depth, and they find various villages off the Jutland coast, Denmark, and they've been excavating, just diving down, but the water's very cloudy. But what we are doing now is these little sort of polder dikes, these little caissons, these floating mulberry harbours, or whatever you want to call them. We've had this technology for many years. The caisson, for example, at Aberthaw, that was floated out before the Second World War. Was it floated out before the Second World War? Maybe slightly around that time, actually. I got that date wrong. But we've had the technology to have these floating harbours for quite some time. D-Day landings, 6th of June 1944. We had these little mulberry harbours, which are these concrete things that we could just dump out of the coast of France. We didn't need to capture Boulogne or Calais. We could create our own deep water little harbours, but basically chucking these things out there, dumping them. They root themselves on the seafloor, and lots of them are still out the coastline of France. They're still there. They haven't been broken up. They're still out there. What I get so excited about is that when they're developing sort of bridges and so on across the landscapes and sort of reclaiming land, they take these artificial towers out, they pump all the water out, and then they get archaeologists to excavate there to see if there's any archaeology there, and then they put the structure on. So in other words, we're now using modern day technology to excavate the archaeology, excavate the seafloor, and this technology is with us. So now we're starting to get a real understanding of what's on the seafloor. Or some archaeologists are moaning and groaning, that by developing the North Sea more, we're going to lose lots of the archaeology. Well, I got to be honest with you, we don't even know a fraction of 1% of the archaeology out there, and the amount of the sea floor that's going to be developed isn't going to be 1%. So the 99% of the seafloor is still able for archaeologists to look at and interpret. The other thing as well is the areas where people are developing, you can get these things down there. The archaeologists can excavate. Bob's your uncle. The developer's paying for it. We're getting the results. Great thing. So, I'm a little bit more of a pragmatist these days. I see the benefits of technology and helping us understand the archaeology. Another thing that we can clearly see is what is the Dogger Bank? Is it a big clump of rock? What is it? Now, Dogger Bank is really interesting. It's a moraine. It's a glacial moraine. There it is. So we believe that as the various ice has melted through various ice ages over the many hundreds of thousands of years, it seems to be depositing material there. That there is a large chunk of muds, sands, silts. So in other words, as the ice is melted, suddenly there's a warm period and it dumps all its crap in one area. Right. The 2 points to be made here is that the very early landscape has got hundreds, well, when I say hundreds of meters, probably about 100 meter, 150 meters or whatever of material dumped on top of it. We do know the Dogger Bank itself is in a region of 18 meters below sea level today. Whether that's high or low tide, I don't know. It's probably more like high tide. But the one thing about this is that this may explain why we've got Doggerland in the first place. It seemed to act as some kind of barrier to the flooding of the lower areas. And with that, it's thanks to glaciation that we ever had that land in the first place. Maybe or maybe not. So what I'd like to do now is, yeah, we've got a little bit still to go. I might not do it all, but what we're going to do is this. I'm going to paraphrase what we're about to say. So if we go back to, hang on. If we go to approximately north of where that yellow thing is there, underneath the word A, there's what we refer to as the Storiga slide. Now, we've really only been thinking about the Storiga slide over the past few decades. Now, a landslip, a submarine landslip, it goes as follows. Most of this I agree with, so I'm going to read it out. The Storiga slide tsunami, tidal wave, would have had a catastrophic impact on the contemporary coastal Mesolithic population. Britain finally, and it says Mesolithic population, so that means the whole of this area, whole of the North Sea area. Britain finally becomes separated from the continent, and in cultural terms, the Mesolithic there goes its own way, which is something that we've been saying. The other point with this reading is, you know, the point I made about Doggerland earlier on being nobody was living there after this great wave. The writer of this piece actually agrees with me. They say, the view that the area had been abandoned at about the same time as the tsunamis, the tidal wave. In other words, nobody was living on Dogger Bank anyway. I would go that at the time of the great tide, anyone living there was killed. Certainly after the tide had left a little bank there with the rest of the landscape completely flooded, nobody was living there. There no animals, no trees, no nothing. Without any trees, there's no rooting into the earth, and therefore the ground's going to disintegrate a lot quicker. I'm not saying for one moment that if there hadn't been this landslip and there hadn't been a flood, that Dogger Bank would still be an island today. I'm sure it would be very interesting to think of Dogger Bank being an island today. Germany would have invaded Britain in the First and Second World War. Job done. Bob's your uncle. Dogger Bank would have been fought over between Denmark and Britain forever. Whoever would have lived there, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that Dogger Bank was lost and submerged many thousands of years ago. Now, discovery and investigation by archaeologists, but I need to make that point, that those two little points that I made a little while ago. This tidal wave, and you think of we've had lecture after lecture about the Mesolithic period, talking about the trees. What happened to the trees? People lived in trees. People cut down trees. People burnt trees. People did this. People trees died. Whatever. Yeah. But there's an even simpler explanation. When the Romans captured and defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Carthage, they salted the land around Carthage so that the Carthaginians could never ever rebel or never become an independent country again. The land was salted, so nothing could ever grow there again. And so is the land today around the Carthaginian landscape. Oh, I'm sure they managed to put some stuff back on the land and they grow it. But it's a very saline landscape, and that's after over 2,200 years. And that's North Africa. If we think about the similar concept, we've got evidence of this tidal wave going 20 miles inland of the current coastline. That would mean that the trees would be killed off, and it's likely that the water didn't leave the landscape maybe for 6 months, maybe for a year, at which point all the trees that had survived, all the grasses that had survived were dead anyway. So nothing would grow there for generations. And in doing so, that cleared millions and millions of trees from our landscape forever. It was a natural phenomenon, not due to the actions of man. And this is why, when we look at the landscapes of Northumberland and we look at the landscapes of northeast Yorkshire, which look very bereft, it's probably going. Some of that is most of the landscape could have recovered slightly, but didn't have the big trees and were therefore easily felled throughout the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age. So that explains the trees quite easily. We got the evidence. We don't postulate. We don't hypothesize. We're not going to hypothesize and postulate now, Goff, right? Salt on the land kills everything, right? You don't spread salt on perfectly good agricultural land because it will kill everything, right? That's not postulation, that's fact. So trees were gone forever. That's a fact. And also the other fact as well is, when we went to the Cairngorms, which is in the heart of good old Scotland, south of Inverness, west of Aberdeen, east of the Hebridean Islands, north of Edinburgh. There's the Cairngorms. We were quite fascinated by the fact that we've been missing the archaeology because it was Mesolithic stuff was in upland areas, and you start to realize something. Penny has totally dropped. What the penny that has dropped is that the reason why they're living in these upland areas isn't because there was nowhere to live. Is it because things were better there? Is simply because they feared the sea. They lived there because they knew they were safe. They lived there and they stayed away from the coastal margins for generations until the Neolithic period. It makes perfect sense. That might be hypothesized, but it certainly answers why we don't get lots of archaeology in lowland areas. That's hypothesized, not necessarily a fact, but maybe there is a fact in something else. When human populations are completely isolated and they've lost everything, remember, the coastline of Denmark, Germany, and France was equally devastated. Those populations didn't come back or survive for generations. Those are people that ain't going to be able to trade with us. They're not going to be able to drag animals across the landscape to go over to this little weird island now in the distance that was never there before. They're going to want to look after themselves. And it starts to make you realize why we've got a massive technological spur in Britain. We start to see things in Orkney that are new. We start to see developments of pottery on Orkney. We start to see some of the Hebridean Islands coming up with new types of sites that are developing. It's very likely that, spurred on by the fact that we were now isolated with most of the population gone, we had to do something. And this brings on technical innovations. I can only look at Japan and Germany after the Second World War. Germany and Japan were finished, but now they've become global powers. You could argue that foreign people invested in those countries, but that wouldn't have been enough. You got foreign countries investing into Africa, and it doesn't do anything. The technological innovations and the factories are closed down, they're looted, and nothing happens with them. The circumstances that happened in Zimbabwe, it takes people to bring those innovations on, and I can't deny that. As we start to ponder and go through now, and what we did mention, and we'll go on for about another just a little bit longer. I mentioned H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells in 1897 in A Story of the Stonehenge. H.G. Wells postulated this based on what evidence? He said a time when one might have walked dry shod from France, as we call it now, to England, and when a broad and sluggish Thames flowed through its marshes to meet its father Rhine, flowing through a wide and level country that is underwater in these days, and which we know by the name of the North Sea. 50,000 years ago it was. 50,000 years if the reckoning of geologists is correct. How the hell did he know that, Gough? This is before science. He wrote it perfectly as it was meant to be written, as Clement Reid would even postulate on a hypothesis in 1913, less than 2 decades later. He described Surrey and Kent, a land stretching out all the way over to France, we believe, but he nailed it. He absolutely nailed it. We mentioned Clement Reid, and we mention him usually most weeks when we look at the Mesolithic period. We don't need to be reminded of Clement Reid's wonderful book, Submerged Forests, and what he gave us in understanding this submerged landscape. Arthur Keith, the curator, director of the British Museum, as he would be, in 1950, wrote the book The Antiquity of Man in 1915, but it was completely, both of these books were ignored, and H.G. Wells was seen to be some kind of a crank who wrote wonderful fictitious books that nobody can believe. But H.G. Wells and Jules Verne wrote about things that we now know are science fact. In 1930, when we go back to that earlier on, the evidence of a big lump of peat ended up in the Hull Museum was trawled up by a vessel known as the trawler Calinda. The trawler Calinda brought up a big lump of peat 25 miles east of Norfolk, and the peat was found to contain a barbed antler point, possibly used as harpoon or fish spear, and this was under a foot in length. This was dated to around 12,000 years ago, at a time when the landscape was believed to mean only anything. It was just sea. But people dismissed what the archaeologists who come up with that conclusion had made. But the archaeologists had nailed it. You don't get peat forming out at sea. Peat forms on dry land, not out at sea. So therefore, this peat must have been where dry land once was. Work only started looking at this landscape, and we start to think about this landscape as being a scientific, factual landscape, and we think about this as a factual scientific landscape where you find artifacts like this based on all the evidence in the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, and they started, there was a Brian E. Coles, and she said, we'll call this land Doggerland because it was a land. On her base and whatever she was coming across, thanks to the help of seismic surveys, thanks to the help of petroleum geoservices and University of Birmingham and their expert Vince Gaffney, who would have been one of those who would have been in time team, they come up with this map that I believe is only 1/10 of the area of this area of Doggerland. This map itself shows, thanks to the petroleum geoservices, the seismic survey and so on, and all the other evidence, this clearly shows where the Great Lake was in the middle of Doggerland, Doggerland itself, this raised area, where all these little streams are. And this is only 1/10 of the landscape. This is helping us really understand this landscape. People say, oh, you know, as I said earlier on, we should stop the development of petrochemical companies on this landscape because we're going to destroy the archaeology. I'm a pragmatist, as you know. we can learn so much from this exploration being done by geochemical companies than we could do with the very limited funding that us archaeologists have. Let's work with these people. Let's work with the people who are developing wind farms. Let's go down to these bottoms where they're developing wind farms in these little caissons, you could call them. Let's do the work. Let's get a map, and they can do whatever they like with their wind farms. Let's join this together. Archaeologists are naturally controversial. That statement is controversial. I'm an archaeologist. I need to think about the archaeology first. And if people want to put wind farms in, so be it. But if they're going to fund archaeology, then I'm all for it. And the other thing as well is, this is why I always argue that I would have been a great supporter of Mussolini in the 1920s and 30s, because he funded archaeology, archaeological work to be undertaken across Italy. And I would have been one of those that would have been funded to do that work. Whatever everybody else does, I don't care. It's the archaeology that speaks volumes, and it's understanding the archaeology that gives us the cognitive approach to understanding the archaeological landscape. Looking within this landscape as well, do you know, they found a skull fragment of a Neanderthal within this landscape dating 40,000 years ago. Not only proving that we've got a landscape that dates back to 12,000 years ago, but a landscape that dates back to earlier generations. And they're starting to find evidence off the coast of the Netherlands as well, as recently as 3 years ago. So really, in closing this today, I want to make this statement. Various universities have been working on this approach for the past decade: Birmingham, Bournemouth, Bradford, St Andrews, Dundee, Aberdeen, various other societies and universities. And they made this statement: we have speculated for years on the lost land's existence from bones dredged by fishermen all over the North Sea. But it's only since working with oil companies in the last few years that we have been able to recreate what this lost land looked like. We have now been able to model its flora and fauna, build up a picture of the ancient people that lived there, and begin to understand some of the dramatic events that subsequently changed the land, including the sea rising and the devastating tsunami. I'll allow them the word tsunami at the end here. And what we've got to say is that since 2015, the University of Bradford's Europe's Lost Frontiers project has been out there to try to expand this coastline, to look at sediment cores, to look at the DNA in these sediment cores, to understand the environment, to understand the colonization of this landscape before it become surrounded in trees. What we do know now is that we're getting evidence of settlements 25 miles off the modern coast of Cromer and Norfolk, settlements that we can find as shallow as 32 meters on the seabed, existence of settlements that have long since been removed 8,500 years ago. Ancient artifacts off the Dutch coastline on a final measure. This is a very strange one. They've been dredging up off the Dutch coast, as we dredge up on our coast, but they've been dredging up off the Dutch coast, large amounts of clay, sand and all the other crap that they dredge up. And they've been taking it inland off the Dutch coast in 2012 to build up the coastline as a coastal protection measure. And in that, they come up with ancient artifacts, from human artifacts to animal artifacts, that they've been dredging up. All the archaeological evidence that Clement Reid would have used to prove the existence of Doggerland. But even with the evidence, people would have dismissed it. But the evidence is so believable that there's too much of it to disbelieve. On that note, we're going to call it a day. Anything you'd like to say, Goff?
No, you sort of answered my questions in your last few comments. So about what's been going on there, who's been excavating, and yeah, very interesting. Very good.
It's a massive palimpsest of evidence it answers my Doggerland question, my Doggerbank question, answers my tree question, answers my technical question. In one moment, I've nailed the past 5 months, which is great. But you couldn't have done it. You couldn't have got those answers if you hadn't have done the groundwork, if you hadn't done all the other lectures, because they wouldn't have meant anything. But now we've got them. So there you go.
It's great.
On
Okay.
that note, Goff, so I'll see you next week, yeah?
Yeah, thanks very much for this morning. I appreciate it.
My
Give my
pleasure.
regards
I
to
know.
everybody.
What's that, lovely?
Give my regards to the rest of the class.
I certainly will, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, well, I'll see you next Friday.
Next Friday, that'll be fine, the same time.
All right, then. Ta-da.
Okay, speak to you soon, Goff. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care, Goff. Take care. Thank you very much. Speak to you then. Thanks for joining us. Cheers. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you've got this live today, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm going. If anyone's put any questions on there, then fine. I'll try and collect them again. I've got to go now. And I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye. Bye-bye. Nothing in the chat box. Nothing. So in my old